Hey guys, welcome to another episode. Today, the day has finally come. We have waited so long for this day. We are going to start building our engine. It is finally back from the machine shop. And you would have seen this post if you guys follow me on Instagram or Facebook at Garage Time TV. So make sure you guys do that so you can see up to the minute updates when we get awesome things like this before it hits the channel. So we have our block done. They've done a 20 thousandths over bore of the cylinders. All new freeze plugs. It's painted. It's been decked. It's had the works done to this thing. So this is all ready to go. We can start the assembly. We've got all of our pieces here on the table beside us, and we're gonna start getting this thing back together. Now I think this is gonna be a two-part series. We're gonna do the first part where we get the whole bottom end taken care of. I already have a video where we've assembled our cylinder head. I'll make sure to drop a link up top for that one. And then in part two, we'll bring it all together and start putting on the accessories as much as we can, at least, until we're able to start dropping the engine in. Maybe we'll even be able to drop that engine in part two. So be on the lookout for that. But you need to be subscribed to make sure you know when that happens. So we're not going to keep on talking. We're going to get right into work. We're going to start on the bench, get some stuff situated and sorted out, and then we'll start moving onto the block and bringing stuff back in. Now it's very important, one last note, is that we're going to be following the assembly guide in our manual, our shop manual, step for step, page for page. So what I'm going to be going through and what I'm going to be doing is exactly what the manual says. We're not going to deviate. So I'm going to make sure that we are very on point. I'll give you as many torque specs as I can, exactly what the manual is wanting us to do, and if I have any little tips on the way, I'll give those to you as well. So anyway, let's jump in, let's get started. So as part of this build, we have all new pistons that also come with brand new wrist pins. So these are all nice and ready to go, 20 thousandths over to match our bore. Now I've already taken off the old piston heads from 3 of the 4 cylinders, but I'm going to show you guys how to do that really quick. There's a little pin in there, little clip, I guess you want to call it, a little C-clip that's in there. And you have to get that out. There's a little divot here. You just go in with a flathead screwdriver. I modified one that I have, got it ground down so it's nice, thin, and fits right in there. And you just pop it out. So let's get these out. With those circlips, those C-clips out, we're going to take a 13mm deep socket and a 6-inch extension, and we're going to be able to drive out our wrist pin from our old piston. And with that wrist pin all the way out, we're able to fully remove our old piston head, and now we have just our connecting rod on the bottom. We're going to grab our wrist pin off the ground and just kind of keep them together. We're not going to end up reusing these. We have our nice new set. So all we have to do is the reverse of this process to put our new pistons in. But we're going to clean these up a little bit, and we're going to grab our assembly lube and really lubricate these, and then we are going to be able to reassemble them and put our clips, our C-clips, back in the little groove that is in there. Hopefully you guys can see there's a thin groove that these ride in. You want to make sure the C is opposite of the divot. So when we put them in, the C needs to face the top, farthest away from the notch, just like that. So let's get these back assembled and we can start working on the block. So I wanted to show you guys really quick how I'm doing this while I'm on the last one here. Is on the C-clip, we're making sure our notch is down. and where that groove is visible, so the wrist pin isn't covering the groove. What I'm doing is taking a small flathead and I'm pushing in the middle here of that clip, and it compresses it together, and it should start getting it in there. And I work the sides with a flathead screwdriver or a really skinny one, and I push it down on both sides, and it slowly works its way into the slot. Sometimes it'll fight you. You got to be careful because this spring will launch out on you if it's not in there correctly, so please make sure you're safe. That way you don't get one of these in your eye. That wouldn't feel very good at all. So we're pressing it in the middle. And as we're pressing, we're going to be squeezing the top to help it seat in there. If I can get it to work with me, where you guys can see it. Alright, so as we get it into the groove, I'm pressing down to try and get it under the surface, and I start working both sides evenly. And slowly working it into the groove down in there. Of course my glove gets stuck like every time. And all I'm doing is working it back and forth. Just like that. And it's in there. Nice and free. And just like that, all four are done. I've been using this engine assembly lube on the wrist pins and in the connecting rods to make sure they're really well lubricated. This is really sticky, tacky stuff, and it's good for building engines, and it's got the high pressure rating, so it'll stay on there for a long time and really good for our first startup. That way we don't burn through those brand new connecting rods and wrist pins. So with our wrist pins and our new pistons on, looking pretty good. Of course, we'll do a quick clean on them before we set them in there, make sure all the debris is off there when we get to that stage. So now I think we're at the point where we can jump on the block. Since we've got our engine flipped over now on our stand, we're going to remove all the bearing caps. If you notice, we've got the numbers all facing the back. So if you're looking at the back of the engine, you could read all the numbers. And another thing to look at, and I'm going to show you real close, up close, is if you look in here, you'll see the tabs are opposite of each other. That means you know you have the exact correct orientation. So as we're working through this, just be mindful of that, where the tabs are opposite and all the numbers are facing the same direction. So we're going to get these caps off, and we're going to start putting our bearings in, and then we're going to get our plastic gauge, which is this right here. It's like $4 from the auto parts store. I went to Advance and pick that up, and then we can see our clearance between our bearings and our crankshaft. So let's get these caps off, let's get our bearings in, we'll rest our crank in there, we'll put in some of this plastic gauge, and we'll see where we're at. So we've got our bearings in. I want you to notice that our middle one is the solid. All the other ones have this center groove in them. And you'll notice that the tabs are lining up with the tabs in the actual block itself. The next thing we're going to grab is the crankshaft. We're going to rest it in there nice and straight as we can. And as tempting as it's going to be, do not turn it. Okay, so this is going to be really tempting, but don't spin it. It's a really bad idea. Because the torque isn't on there all the way down, holding it truly round. And so it may warp and make a soft spot or a worn out spot on the bearings. So do not turn it. But the next thing we're going to do is to take a piece of our plastic gauge. We're going to cut a piece of it off, if y'all can see it. Take our plastic gauge, cut a clip, and put it on the front of our snout here. We're going to torque all these down, and we'll see what we come out with. So we've got our plastic gauge in there. You can see a little tab sticking out. We've also got one in the back. The manual only calls for the front, but I'm going to do the back also, just to make sure that we're even all the way across. So we're going to torque these in a crisscross pattern, starting from the middle and working our way out. And it's 83 foot-pounds on the 19mm bolts. We have one 17mm, and that one calls for 53 or 59, I believe. 59 foot-pounds on this one, and 83 on the rest. So let's get them torqued, and we'll find out what our feeler gauge tells us. As we begin to torque these, we're going to start them really small. We have these all just hand tight in here, and then we're going to progressively torque them in that star pattern. We're going to start at 20 and jump up to 40, 60, and then finally 83. And this one we end at 59. So we're just going to continually do that pattern little by little, making sure nice and even as it sucks it all the way down into the block. Now we're going to bump it up to 40. Next we're going to go up to, you could do 60, but this one's 59, so we're going to go to 59 right there. That way we can do our final torque on that one when we get there. Alright, that's our final torque for that one. And now we're going to bump it up to our final one, which is 83 for all of our 19mm bolts in the middle. Okay, so that's the final torque on all of those. Now what we're going to do is take it all off. So we're going to zip all these back out. We want to be very careful not to turn the crankshaft, because if we turn the crankshaft, it'll skew our answer for our plastic gauge and it'll throw off our results. So we're going to be very careful when we go to pull the front and the back. That way we don't smudge it or smear it. So let's get these off and then we'll take a look. So we're going to remove our end cap here. It's fully loose. We can see where it has crushed down, and we're going to take our gauge here, and we're looking at 0.002, let's see, 001, 0015. I think 0015 is right where we're at on the front. And we can look on the back and see what we got there. About 0015 on the back also, and this is in inches. So let's take a look at our book and see if we're within spec. So here we are at the manual. We took it and put a slip on the crank snout here. And when we look here to our settings, we need to between 0012 and 0030. So our 0015 is a little on the tighter side, but it is well within this number here. So that's good. We are within spec. So all we need to do now is come back over here and clean off this material very lightly. Nothing that's abrasive. Clean it off here and here. And that means that we can remove the crank, put some assembly lube on here, and keep going. This is great news, great progress, a great way to start. Alright, so we're going to go back to our handy assembly lube. There's also time to add our thrust washers. These go on the backs. On the outside here goes one. And when you have the assembly lube on there, it helps. And the other one goes here on the inside on the rear. And that'll take up your end plate gap. And we'll measure for that once we get that all assembled in there. So we're just going to grease this up here. We're also going to do it on the cap side. Then we'll be able to torque down the crankshaft again, just like we did a second ago. And we'll be able to hopefully keep that in for good. So we are all torqued to 83 foot-pounds on our large 19mm bolts, and this one is 59. Now that it's all torqued, our thrust washers are in. It's really important to make sure that the grooves face out on those, away from the middle. But now the ultimate test is going to be, can we turn this over by hand and it be really quiet? We don't want any crash, what do you want to call it? Scratching sounds. We want to make sure it's nice and quiet. The fan's going to kind of throw it off a little bit, but we should be able to turn this by hand. So here we go. Oh yeah. Super easy to turn by hand, which means that those are seated correctly, fully torqued. So now we can move on to the next thing. So now that our crankshaft is installed, we're going to start moving back to our pistons. We have our brand new sets of rings. They come with the instructions and what goes where. 1, 2, and 3. There's even got a nice picture on there where they go. What we're going to do is we're going to take one of our rings and we're going to take it over to our bore on our cylinder. We're going to slide it in there. I'm going to show you guys how to do that, and we're going to measure the gap before we do all the work of putting the rings on there, and then they're not going to work. So let's get over to the block and see what we measure out to. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our ring, we're going to place it in the cylinder. Just inside like that. Now what I'm going to do is you take the piston upside down, and that way you get a nice even surface. And I go down to where the first gap is on there. I'm going to bring it out. I'm going to grab my feeler gauge, and that should give us a pretty accurate measurement of what our gap is going to be, so long as it's straight. So we've got our ring. This is our top ring, and when I use the piston to push that down into the cylinder, this is the gap it creates. Now to be within spec is 0.30 millimeters. I don't know how well you're going to be able to read that. So we're going to try and fit this in that gap there, and it does. So we're within spec. It's a little tight, but we can get it in there just fine. There's just a of drag. So that means we are well within spec on our rings on here. So that's a good sign that we're on the right direction. So now we can start putting our rings on our pistons. So we're going to be installing our piston rings. We're going to start, we go from the top down. We're going to be starting with our lowest one first. It's going to be our oil ring. You don't want to go from the bottom up because you run the risk of scratching the skirting, and that can cause damage to your cylinder walls. So make sure we're going from the top down. The two colors need to be visible. That's according to the manufacturer's specs. And these are supposed to be in opposite corners. One here, one here. So the first thing to do is to install the top one. Put it in the slot you're going to need it to, and I open up this side, and I carry it down. If you have a small set of needle nose, it really makes your job a lot easier as you walk it down into the slot. Okay, that's the top one. And now we're going to find the gap, which I didn't do correctly, of course. Alright, so now we're going to install the bottom ring. I'm going to place that in that very bottom groove and work it around this way. And these small needle nose really make a difference, being able to control it with the tension that's on there. Okay, just like that. We'll move on to our second ring. You want to note the orientation of the ring. This one says top. Sometimes they have a little dot or two dots to indicate what level it's on, but which way it needs to go. So on this, we're going to be opposite direction of our piston rings, of our oil rings, excuse me. And we're going to go down to the second layer. Just like that. And we're going to go 120 degrees for our top one, again looking for the orientation. Okay, that's all there is to it, to installing the oil rings. We just want to make sure the gaps are spaced evenly. These rings end up turning in the cylinder anyway, but to start it out, we want to make sure we don't have them all in a straight line because oil will get right by. So now our skirt is nice and clean, no damage done to it coming from the top like that. And we're just going to double check our gaps. So I need to fix this one here. But we're going to double check our gaps, make sure we can see both colors. And all the other ones are done, which means that we can start putting these in the block, and we'll be able to take our plastic gauge right here and check for tolerance to make sure we're within spec, and then we can keep going from there. As we're getting ready to install these, we want to make sure that we put our bearings in. It's just like the crankshaft. Insert them, make sure you have the notch lined up correctly on the connecting rod itself and on the cap on the bottom. Those notches are opposites of each other, and the numbers, these aren't the correct ones, but the numbers will line up on the side when we go to install them. So make sure you have those in, just like that. So as we go to insert our pistons into the cylinders, we're going to coat them with some shell rotella, some T4. It's got a zinc additive in it. It's meant for diesel engines, but it's got all the good stuff for flat tappet cams like ours. We're going to coat the cylinder walls in this just with our finger. That way there's something in there and it's not dry. And I've also got the crankshaft journals on 4 and 1 all the way to the bottom, which means 2 and 3 are all the way at the top. So we're going to insert number 1 and number 4 first, because they'll be able to go all the way down. Then we'll flip it over once we get those in there, and we'll put our plastic gauge in there and do our tolerance specs. So we're ready to install our number 1 piston. You can see here it's got the number 1 on it, and when we put our cap on, it'll also have a number 1, so we need to make sure those ones are lined up. Most importantly, we need to make sure that one is facing away from the auxiliary shaft. The auxiliary shaft is on this side of the engine. A really easy way to remember that is that the Fiat logo on the connecting rod itself faces forward. So we're going to slowly take this in here. We don't want to scratch the walls. Okay, just like that, we made sure it's nice and seated. And I use a rubber mallet with a wooden handle, and I lightly tap it down as to not damage it. I want to make sure that the ring compressor is nice and flat to the surface of the head, of the top of the block here, and we're just going to tap it in. Okay, that's all there is to it for that's cylinder number 1. Another easy way to remember is our intake is always larger than our exhaust. So that's why we've got the bigger cutout for our valve here. We wanted more fuel and air, and it's going to burn out and go out that smaller hole. So that's one done. We're going to do the same process all the way across, get them all connected. So the next thing we're going to be installing is our oil pump. There is a gasket that goes on top when it mates to the body. It slides right in here. And we've got 2 long bolts that go through here. Start them by hand. And these get torqued to 14 foot-pounds. So the next thing we're going to be installing is our auxiliary shaft. I have the nut or the bolt in it to help guide it in. There's a bearing here and there's another bearing on the inside. I had the machine shop press those in for me. They have the right tools to do that, and I don't here at the garage, but I had them press that in for me. And what we're going to do is slowly feed this in. This nut on the front, this bolt. The bolt on the front helps us have control over guiding it through. And we're going to make sure we don't scratch up the bearings as we go. And just like that, we are there. Okay, not too bad. We'll start installing the retaining clip that goes around it, which is right here. So this goes around it and holds that in place. Helps if I put it on the right side, huh? I'm looking at it upside down. There we go. Okay, so that goes in there. It's got 2 10mm bolts. Always start everything by hand. That way we don't cross thread, because that would not be fun. Okay, just like that. Alright, so we're going to be installing our water pump. We've got our gasket on the back, and these are 10mm nuts. They are not anything, 10mm bolts. They're not anything crazy big, so no need to go crazy on the torque. If I can align it correctly, there we go. They're not going to require a lot of force, anything like that, so we're just going to get them on there and make sure it's tight, you know, anywhere in the 10 to 12 foot-pound range. We'll do the job for you. So the next part we're going to be working on is going to be right here. This is where our tensioner pulley sits, roughly, if I don't knock y'all all over the place, roughly in this area. So the first thing we're going to want to do is install the lower nut, the lower bolt. If you'll notice, this one's got like 2 heads on it and a smooth in the middle. That's where our spring, the bottom of the spring rests. We're going to install this one. Now you notice I'm not running the tin that goes between the actual engine, all the belt, and then the outer cover. It's a real pain in the butt to get on and off when you have to service things, and a lot of people end up just leaving them off, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm just not going to use it. It's a thin metal piece, and it's just a real pain in the butt, so we're not going to worry about that on this. I'm sure some other people have other opinions about that, but we're not using it on this one. The next thing we're going to put in is our spring for our tensioner. It's got the spring, there's a, I guess you want to call it like a shim or a bushing, and a washer and lock washer. And this tab is what rests in that gap, and this hook hooks on the top of our tensioner here. So we'll make sure we're facing the right direction and just tighten this in by hand. Alright, with that in there, our bolt on the bottom is still loose. Now what you would normally do is have the head attached, and you'd run the belt, and then you'd put this on last to pick up all the slack. But we don't have our head on yet, so we're going to be installing our bolt here in the middle. And this is a really thick washer, and I'm going to do my best to center it on the middle of this bearing. That way we don't ruin the outer part of it. This is a brand new bearing, so it's nice and quiet, and gonna make all the difference. All right, now normally you don't have the double nut on here because there's that metal piece that goes in between those, and those lock together, but we're just gonna leave it like that. It's not gonna hurt anything. The next thing we're going to want to do is remove the bolt from our auxiliary shaft, and we're going to place the pulley on there. It's got the locating pin just like that. Just loosely put it back in there. And this is timing up our auxiliary shaft. You'll see it's got a hole right here, and we will turn the auxiliary shaft to where that hole faces this bolt. Right about there. And we'll remove it. And that's how we know it's in time. Just for visual sake, you guys can see how that lines up. But yeah, we want this hole to point to the spring bolt on there. Like I said, we're not going to attach that quite yet. So let's move on to the next thing. We're going to do a quick check on everything, make sure everything is all tightened up, torqued up, and set, and verify that we're all in good shape. Alright guys, that's going to be the end of this episode. That's the end of part 1 of our 2-part series. And as we go to build our 1982 Fiat 124's engine from the block up, we've got the entire bottom end taken care of, from the crankshaft to piston rings and the shafts installed, new tensioner bearing, the water pumps installed, all new gaskets, nice and painted. Everything is installed. There's of course a couple pieces that we're missing, just because they're easier to install when the head is attached to the bottom end. We've already finished our cylinder head, and if you guys haven't watched that video, I'll make sure to drop a link up top for that one. And so that is actually done and ready to go on top of this. But joining it all together is going to be the second part of our 2-part series. That way we can see it all together. We've got a great accessories to attach to it, to really bring it all to life and really make it like a nice engine that this car deserves. Things like the alternator and all the hoses and things like that will wait to install until it's actually in the car. That way we're not fighting all of it when we go to drop it back in the car. But anyway, that's all on part 2. Thank you so much for watching this first part of our 2-part series. I really do appreciate it. Make sure you guys subscribe, like, and comment. It really does me a huge, huge favor when you do that. I do this for you, so please subscribe. That way I can keep doing this and making these projects and these cars roadworthy to put them back out there for others to enjoy. So thank you guys so much, and until next time, we'll see ya.